Hey, welcome to the Piecing It Back Together podcast. There's no intro music because I couldn't get intro music while also doing a podcast with another person on Zoom, which is okay. But that means that there is another person, so you guys don't have to listen to me for an hour and 15 minutes like in the 1 Peter and who is the author of it episode. And so I won't waste time. I want to introduce who's with me. He is actually a recent friend of mine. We met in March. Yeah, the end of March in Boston. It is Christopher McCormick. Introduce yourself, brother.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm a current theology student at Boston College, about to start my doctoral studies in patristics and history of Christianity, and always excited to talk about the faith and the history of the faith. So looking forward to being on the podcast.
Yeah, I'm excited that you're here. Chris and I, we met at a event at Boston College, and someone brought him over to me because they're like, "You like history of Christianity? I know a guy." And literally walked across the room, grabbed Chris, brought him to me. I think we talked for like 2 hours at a table.
I think it was basically the rest of that event, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I mean, it was however long that event went on for,
Yeah.
about, I mean, anything and everything. And I was like, I like this guy. He's got a lot of cool things to say. And so was thinking the other day, I've been wanting to do sort of a series on why Constantine's important to the church, because I feel like, I mean, I have the Chi-Rho tattooed on my middle finger. And so the Chi-Rho is recognizable. Tons of people have that tattoo. And it is a straight reference to Constantine and sort of the history with him, but also he is a very important figure in the church, especially in church history, the construction of the church and Roman history of how that continues. He's also a very important person to talk about when you start talking about the councils, because Constantine, I think Constantine really gives a boost to the councils and allows them to happen in a way that most Roman emperors weren't doing. But before that, I wanted to let you guys get to know a little bit more about Chris. And so why don't you tell everybody about maybe a little bit of how you came to the study of theology, a little bit about your faith and background, and just, yeah, we'll go from there.
Sure. So I was born Christian, raised Christian, been Christian all my life. Was Protestant for a long time, Church of the Nazarene, and then Episcopalian, and then converted to the Catholic Church in 2022. So now I've been Catholic for almost 3 years, and I always had a real interest in thinking through the faith, thinking through sort of intellectual questions about the faith. Um, Initially, because when I was in high school, I went through sort of a spiritual crisis where I nearly left Christianity and I didn't really know if I still believed it and if I was going to. I had all of these questions about it. And one of the things that helped me through that crisis was thinking through some of the more intellectual questions of the faith, because part of my worry was I needed to believe in a faith that was um, rational, that was sort of logically coherent. And I discovered I needed to believe in a faith that was historically coherent. I needed to believe in a Christianity that had a real sense of continuity from, the Bible to the present day. I wasn't satisfied in the denomination where I grew up, because we sometimes spoke as if church history sort of went Jesus, the apostles, and then you sort of blink and you're in Methodism in the 1800s. And that big 1800-year gap in the middle of that really used to bother me. And so I got into reading these early church figures. From what I remember in those days, I was reading Ignatius and Polycarp and some Irenaeus and sort of reading all over the place. But um, reading those early figures really helped me understand that there is a continuity between the early church and the church of today. And that helped ease my way out of crisis mode. And even after the crisis passed, I still found that I loved reading those early figures and thinking through what Christianity meant for them in those early centuries. And so I just sort of kept doing that, and eventually went to college and studied theology in college, doing historical questions, and continued on in a master's program. And here I am today.
Have you done your whole degree at BC?
I did my undergraduate degree at Holy Cross in Worcester, which is what the I don't know if my camera's on the podcast, but I'm wearing a gray shirt with the Holy Cross logo on it, and the hat I'm wearing is of the minor league baseball team in Worcester, also.
Okay. Okay. Where's that?
And it's about 50 minutes west of Boston.
Okay.
It's kind of straight down the Mass Pike. Yeah, I'd say, well, depending on traffic, about 50 minutes west of Boston.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting.
So not too far.
You made your way. You didn't jump quickly into Catholicism. You like started over here and then slowly Episcopalian, and then finally to where the Episcopalians almost kind of seem like where they want to be, but don't let themselves be. No offense to Episcopalians. It's always funny to me.
Offense.
Episcopalians and Anglicans both typically called like the soft Catholics of the Protestants.
Yeah.
Which is
That was I think slow is the right way to put it. It was I remember really early on in my time at Holy Cross, I had a friend ask me about my opinions about Catholicism, and I told him that I was pretty high church Episcopalian, probably close to becoming Catholic, but there were a couple of things that I hadn't yet come around on, and I couldn't see myself converting. And it wasn't until almost 3 years after that conversation that I finally joined RCIA and ended up becoming Catholic. So I took my sweet time for a few years in there, but by the time I did, I was really sure that it was the right decision, and it's been I think almost 2 years now, or almost 3 years, and yeah, it's felt like home the whole time, and I think it will continue to.
Yeah. I think the cool thing about your kind of progression towards Catholicism and also sort of us having this conversation, and a little bit of you and me being kind of two different the two different kinds of people that you might find at Boston College is we're not really different. Like at the end of the day, when we had our conversations in Boston, Catholic and Protestant, there wasn't much difference really between either of us. It was just few minimal doctrinal differences in things where you believe certain things about the church and about doctrines that I was like, I don't know if I'm on that. But when it comes to the doctrine of Christ, the doctrine of the gospel, I mean, truly, it has been said to me before, well, the two things, one, Catholics don't believe in the same God. They have idols. Or two, which is so stupid in my opinion, or two, you have we believe in the same gospel. It's like very similar to denominational differences. There's just theological differences. But when it comes to what's really important, also Protestants don't get any queries towards Catholicism because you can thank them for Trinitarian theology, pretty much, just about like literally all of it, and the structure of the church. But who am I? Whatever. And that's cool. That's similar conversion to me. Really loved history and found that. I mean, this is the reason that I went into theology, which I think I told you. I just thought Christianity can't be that dull when I was going to church. Like, not that church was dull. There just came a point where I was like, there has to be more. Like, I'm reading more in my Bible. There has to be more. There has to be more to, like, these are 2,000-year-old texts that we're reading. Some of them way older. Because I started in the Old Testament, somehow made it out, and somehow became Christian before I got to the New Testament. And there had to be more. And that's one of the reasons why I love this podcast and I love having these conversations. There's more. There always is more. And when you learn more, I think you can probably attest to this. I'll get off my soapbox here after this, but when you learn more, especially even like the historical realm of learning more about Christianity, I think my faith drastically increases, like tenfold. So, yeah.
Yeah. It's funny. I know people like you and I for whom that's been the case, and I know other people for whom it was the exact opposite,
Which is
something I
interesting.
wonder about. I know some people who, the more they learned about the history, the more they learned about, say, textual and manuscript questions about the Bible, it was the exact opposite for them. Like they
Mm,
found themselves they found themselves having increased doubts about the faith rather than
mm,
increased faith. Um, and I often think about why that happens to some people and why the opposite seems to have happened to people like you and me. Um, but it makes me that much more grateful to have had the opportunity and to feel that faith grow stronger. Um, and I think maybe context is a big deal. I don't know if this was the case for you, but for me, um, I was learning history of Christianity from people who really were serious Christians. I mean, they were serious historians, but they were serious Christians first, and their Christianity was more fundamental to who they were than their identity as historians,
mm.
um, which didn't prevent them from being good historians at all, but
Yeah.
it did mean that um, they always couched the history in concern for the faith,
Mm,
in concern for will this make you more virtuous? Will it bring you closer to Christ? Will it help you pray?
mm.
And most of the people that I learned history of Christianity from were very suspicious of any attempts to do something like patristics apart from taking seriously the spiritual dimension of what we were studying. So I
Mm.
think that helped a lot because I think not everyone who does patristic study and not everyone who does history of Christianity cares about that dimension of it.
Yeah.
And so I was very lucky to have people around me who took that seriously, who take it seriously, and who expect their students to take it seriously if they're gonna do history of theology or patristics or whatever term you want to use.
Yeah. I think first, patristics, we should probably define that term.
Oh yes, it's kind of nebulous, and some people I think are kind of sick of the term and think it's outdated. But anyway, patristics is historical theology. It studies the early period of Christian history. Generally, people disagree, but often people say sort of the first thousand-ish years of church history. And it's called patristics because it's closely associated with the study of the church fathers,
Mm.
father, pater, hence patristics. So I use that term as a shorthand for the stuff that I do because that's the period of church history that I deal with most. But some people are um, increasingly antsy about that term. Some people prefer early Christian studies, early church studies, what have you. But patristics was always the term that I was taught to use, and it's the one that feels most natural to me even now.
Yeah. I think it's a good term, but I think too, and I'll say this, then we'll pray and get into really the bulk of what we're talking about. But to what you're saying on the end of why some people learn more and then they have their doubts, it's so interesting that I think that it might just be because I'm going through the 1 Peter series right now and I'm in the middle of it. And so doing tons of studies on it and the Spirit speaks through the scriptures, like always. He always does. But I think it's really cool to see that Peter writes to these people that he's writing to in Asia Minor, so modern day Turkey, and he says to them in his opening blessing in verse 6, he says, where is it? In which you exalt a little now, if being necessary, it is having been grieved in various trials, so that the tested character of your faith, more valuable than gold, than than the perishing by fire, but being tested, it may be found for praise and glory and honor at revelation of Jesus Christ, whom having not seen you of, in whom now, not seeing, but believing, you exalt with joy, with inexpressible joy, and with having been glorified, receiving the end of the faith, your salvation of your souls, concerning that which is your salvation. The only Bible I have in front of me is this Greek text, so that's why it sounds funky.
Oh, nice.
Which is not like supposed to be a sudden flex. It's like literally the closest Bibles across the room. But what's really interesting about this, Peter frames it in sort of a sense of, he's using certain Greek words here that gives a two-way sense of, in which like you have the opportunity that you are being grieved because of these trials. In amidst those trials, he says that the tested character of your faith. And so he gives sort of this exhortation of that it may be found, because there are some that might turn away due to this testing of their faith. And that word testing, which derives from dokimazomenu, it actually, I think, can also mean temptation, and can also mean sort of just in general any trial. And so I think that it is the case that, and then he gets into like, you don't see Jesus, but you love him. And you have an inexpressible joy, one that's confusing and has a lot of doubts, but he is responding. And so I think it's interesting that Peter already in the early church is already, or whoever writes this letter is already like coming into conversation with people about these things that are very knowledgeable, as well about the conversation of, you don't see him, but you love him. And so, I think that's a great place to pray. We can get into it 15 minutes in. So, Chris, I'll ask you to pray, and then let's talk about Constantine.
All right, pray, and we'll talk a little bit about Constantine. All right, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Lord, we thank you for today, and we thank you for this opportunity to grow closer together in friendship and grow closer to you as we think through the ways in which people up and down the centuries have struggled to love you, and the ways in which through your Holy Spirit you've comforted them and brought them into unity and shown them the truth. We pray that whatever we say in this podcast will be edifying for you, and that we can make a good witness through the work that we do here. And we pray that you'll help us to know you better today than we did yesterday, and to know you better tomorrow than we do today. We pray all of these things in your name. Amen.
Amen. The Catholic cross, I know it's different than the Orthodox. Is it left or right first?
So I actually do it the Orthodox way.
So right.
I do, let's see, I don't often think about it because it's sort of automatic now. Yeah, I do right then left.
Okay.
And the reason I do that is when I was first learning the sign of the cross, I had a roommate in college, a guy I lived with my last 2 years of undergrad, who was Melkite Catholic. And so he was Roman Catholic, but he was part of one of the Catholic churches that's Greek Orthodox in its ancestry and in its liturgical traditions, but in communion with Rome.
Wow.
And so the way I first learned to do the sign of the cross was the Eastern way. And by the time I learned that there were different ways of doing it, that way it had become habit. And so I tried at one point to kind of get myself into doing it the Western way. But the habit just never took. The way I learned it first was just the way I always ended up doing it, which always looks a little funny to people with a sufficiently discerning eye to notice that. But it's just a little quirk of how I learned the sign of the cross, and
just an ecumenical weapon.
Yeah, that's cool that you noticed that, though. Not everyone pays enough attention to notice that I make the sign of the cross that way. So that's cool that you noticed.
I have a dear friend that I lived with who actually in, I think, February just got chrismated, and he's in the Orthodox Church. And so
nice.
He was teaching us about, this is the Orthodox way, but then the Catholic way that they do it. And it's funny to me that the Catholic way is to the east first,
Mm-hmm.
and then the West, but the Catholics are from the West. Anyways, let's talk about Constantine. Let's get serious. So we had a little bit of a conversation when I was in Boston about the origination of Christianity and sort of how it comes to be. And so really quickly, we have Jesus dies, resurrects, his ministry, it's boomed, and the apostles are traveling, spreading the gospel. What's the Greek for gospel? Why am I forgetting?
Oh, evangelion.
The evangelion, this victorious message of conquering. And they're going literally like everywhere. Paul's going to tons of places, and he had a very long mission. And then Peter is going out to different places. They're grouping different people and then sending those people to different places. And so now the church begins to build up. You have the East that forms under, the East is in Constantinople, correct?
The Eastern Church, you mean?
Yeah.
Constantinople doesn't really become an important imperial. It doesn't become an important city for the life of the church really until the 5th century.
Okay.
Constantine is the one who makes it the capital of the empire, hence the old name of the city, Constantinople. It doesn't become an important ecclesiastical city until really the 5th century.
Okay. And so
there are a few important churches in the East at that point. In the early periods of the church, Alexandria, Carthage. Well, Carthage was kind of more Western, even though geographically it was in North Africa. But Alexandria, Jerusalem, Caesarea, Antioch, those were some of the important churches in the East.
Okay.
At least in pre-Constantine.
Okay. So you have sort of two traditions forming, which is, I think, really important leading up to our, maybe not two traditions forming, but it's much more, that's just a really broad way to say, Christianity wasn't just forming in the Orthodox way, nor the Catholic way. It was taking root apostolically, but then as time progressed, it starts to, there starts to be different ideas that come up that become very, very important around the time of Constantine and when the councils begin. But the place where we need to start is with understanding why Constantine's important is understanding the period prior to Constantine, around starting with Nero, which I'm sure you have tons to say about this, but Nero highly persecutes Christians, particularly in the Roman area.
Yeah.
And then you get a little bit of a period where the Jews are thrown out,
right?
Because the Jerusalem temple gets destroyed. And then you have Domitian who comes in, and he's not really, Domitian's like kind of just has a query with what the Latin word collegia talks about, which is just kind of people groups who were political threats. And so Christianity was like somewhat a political threat. And if you really got on his nerves, he'd kick you out of Rome, probably not kill you. And most Gentiles, here's the big thing that I noticed in some of my studies recently. It wasn't the emperors who first had a query with Christianity. It was the Gentiles, it seems. It was the people of Rome who were like, you're not worshiping our gods? Like, because the Christians were a different group. They weren't the Jews. They weren't an old religion that Rome respected because they were old. They were new.
Right.
They were considered new to Rome. And this sparks controversy between the Christians and the Gentiles. Well, this controversy between the Christians and Gentiles that's circulating throughout the Roman Empire and in higher positions of power really becomes a thing in the early 2nd century, which I'll let you kind of talk about. Something that Chris and I read, and I'll link I'll put the bibliography in the description. But Pliny writes this letter to Trajan it's circa 111, 112. And this letter gives us sort of the idea of what was occurring during that time, during the early 2nd century, of what was beginning to take off in terms of Christian persecution. So give us a little, Chris, on Christian persecution and how that took off and kind of taking off from Pliny.
So the letter, there's this correspondence between Pliny the Younger and the Emperor Trajan in the early 2nd century. Most scholars think around maybe 110 or 112 or something like that, in which Pliny writes to Trajan about these weirdo Christians who keep popping up around. And he describes them a little bit. He describes how he deals with them, and he asks for Trajan's advice about how he should handle the Christians. And this letter is pretty helpful for getting a sense of how Christians were treated at that time, both because of sort of what the letter says and what the letter implies about the Christians. So just looking at some of the important things about this letter. So one of the things that Pliny says is he brings in the Christians because there are these nasty rumors flying around about what Christians do. There are these rumors that Christians, when they meet, and at this point, it seems pretty clear that Christians, even by the early 2nd century, are accustomed to meeting on the first day of the week. But there are all these rumors that when Christians meet, they meet and commit a lot of crimes and do all this evil, nefarious stuff together. There was, at least we know from Pliny and also from Justin Martyr, that Christians would occasionally refer to their worship services as love feasts. And Romans had this rumor going around that these love feasts were essentially like orgies, which is odd to say the least. But yeah, there was this notion that orgies were involved, and there was also an idea that Christians were sacrificing and eating human flesh during their services. And so Pliny brings in these Christians to sort of investigate this and to try and get them to recant their Christianity, try and get them to worship images of the emperor. So one of the things he would do is he would interview these people he'd bring in and ask if they're Christian, and he would ask them to renounce Christ and worship an image of the emperor Trajan, which got sort of a variety of responses. Some Christians would deny being Christian, worship the image of the emperor, he'd let them go. Some people would say, I used to be Christian, but now I'm not, haven't been in a long time. They would worship the image of the emperor, he'd let them go. Some people would refer themselves as Christian, and they would obstinately refuse to worship the image of the emperor Trajan. And when they would refuse, Pliny would punish them. And Trajan, in his response to Pliny, seems to support this kind of measured approach. Trajan doesn't seem to want to punish Christians just prima facie by the fact that they're Christians, but he says business as usual is a fair plan. Interview them. If they'll renounce Christ and worship the imperial cult, then fine, and then punish them duly if they refuse and if they're obstinate about it. So we get this early attestation that there is some persecution of Christians, but it's not an automatic, if you have a Bible in your home, we're going to execute you. It's sort of you might get arrested, questioned by the government, perhaps pressured into worshiping the imperial cult and rejecting Christ. But at least in the early 2nd century, when we get this conversation between Pliny and Trajan, we're not yet at the kind of brutal mass persecution that we associate with, say, Decius or Diocletian or someone like that.
Yeah. I think the one thing that I took away from that whole thing, not that I didn't take anything else away, was where you said that Christians were meeting on the first day of the week. And all I have to say to that is, take that, Seventh-day Adventist. Take that.
Yeah, it seems pretty clear from early on that Christians disagreed about a lot of things early on, but they did often, it seems, meet on the first day of the week.
Hey, I wanted to take a quick pause in the episode and let you know that I have a Patreon. And so if you love the Piecing It Back Together podcast and would like to support it financially, you can do so at the link in the bio or go to patreon.com/piecing it back together. There's nothing special on there. I'm not really doing extra content or anything. It's just a way for you to support me making these episodes and also to support me as I go throughout grad school. If you don't know, I'm getting my master's degree in the fall, and then I'm going to continue on to get more education. And that's pretty much how I can make these episodes. And so I'm appreciative and grateful for absolutely anything, even if you're just a listener and you don't financially support, but wanted to let you know that that is something that I have. And so I hope that this episode has helped you. It's blessed you. I hope it continues to do so. So let's get back into talking to Chris about Constantine and the Nicene controversy. Yeah, love you guys. I think what's so interesting is that Pliny seems more concerned than Trajan, and Pliny's he's a lawyer, right? Or legal.
I believe he's a lawyer. Yes.
Yeah, and so he seems very zealously against Christianity, and what really strikes me isn't so much that it wasn't so much like. One of my first thoughts, wouldn't sacrificing almost be accepted in the imperial cult? Well, somewhat maybe, and maybe even orgies. But it was the strict separation that Christianity had from that imperial cult. The absolute rejection, which is why the rejection of the imperial cult is such an important aspect of what really pushes persecution, because that rejection shows, oh, these are things that we can say they're doing and sort of hide away in the stash of the imperial cult as like a weird thing that happens, that whatever, maybe might be like modern politics, but it really is important that the distinction lay there, because that continues to make the persecution get worse, which fast forwards us to, I think, I pronounce it Diocletian. You said Diocletian.
Oh, I've never paid much attention to how different people pronounce it. I think either way is fine.
Well, Diocletian, I think that's a good place to fast forward to, because in between the period of Diocletian and Trajan, persecution, I mean, like, it kind of gets worse. It just stays very much the imperial cult is out for Christians who will not submit to them. But when Diocletian comes along, you get the tetrarchy. I think it's the second tetrarchy.
Yes.
Which is the late 3rd century, very early 4th century, because Diocletian's reign ends in 305. And then everybody's fighting over who's going to get the reign after that. Diocletian breaks things up in Rome. He creates the Caesar and the Augusti, or is it?
Mm-hmm.
And
Augustus and then Caesar. Yeah.
And so he creates these positions, which are like state governors, basically, almost. They're governing particular areas throughout Rome, and everything starts to be based on what the governors think. They control their areas. It's very much like what you see. It's very odd. The American government is very much formulated off the Roman government, which is fun and weird to see when you're doing Christian history. But persecution really breaks out then. And I'd love to hear what you have to say on. So Diocletian gets in, the tetrarchy really blows up. Now persecution goes to a different level. What does it look like now?
It does. So the first thing I'd say is, one of the curious things about the persecution is it's, like you said, the refusal to partake in the imperial cult is a big part of what gets Christians in trouble. With Diocletian, there's also a heightened worry that the Christian refusal to contend with the imperial cult is angering the gods. So there are a couple of moments early in his reign where political moves go wrong for him, and when he consults the augurs, they essentially say it's because you have too many Christians around you,
The
and
augurs.
they keep
Who are they?
messing with you. Oh, I shouldn't use that term because it's too technical at this period. But as like maybe oracle is a better term. It's a little bit
Okay.
broader. But the people he consults to speak to the gods on his behalf and tell him what's wrong, essentially.
Okay.
Um, and at two important moments, a political move goes badly for him. He consults the oracles, and the oracles say it's the Christian's fault.
Mm,
And so he decides we're going to do widespread crackdown. He charters churches. He persecutes Christians, executes a lot of Christians. A lot of martyrs come from his reign. Um, his persecutions were um, more regional than a lot of popular histories would suggest, but they were still pretty brutal. And he produced a ton of martyrs. He told Christians to turn in Bibles and texts from the fathers and mothers. Like it was a pretty systematic crackdown, and probably the most systematic crackdown of all the major persecutions of the early church. It was pretty intense.
I think it was a question that actually arises in me. So one of the things that I love studying is textual reception history. Love reception history. It's so important. That if you don't know, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's the history of receiving text throughout history, and especially in Christianity, that's a big thing, or religious traditions. I love learning about the mothers of the church in our reception history because it seems like a lot of their texts got destroyed. That's a conversation for another podcast episode. But is this one of the reasons? Could this be one of the reasons a lot of our texts that we have? So one of the earliest papyrus that we have, P72 of 1 Peter, is from the 4th century. And so a lot of the early texts that we have in general are 4th century. Anything earlier than that is just mind-boggling. Could this be the reason as to why the text that we have today aren't older? They're not from the 1st century. Or could it be the reason why many of the mothers of the church found their texts completely destroyed?
Oh, it's one possible explanation. I mean, another. Okay, so I'll answer those questions separately. So on the 4th century question, part of it is it's not so much. Part of it is that Diocletian had a lot of these texts burned, but part of it is also that we it takes money and it takes labor to copy manuscript texts.
Okay.
Someone has to sit there, and if you have one scribe do it by hand, or for the richer churches they might have someone dictating to an army of scribes who are copying it by hand, but someone has to sit there and do this by hand, and that takes time, it takes money, it takes labor. So before or in the early period of the church, before the church has government backing, you might imagine. So first of all, in the early periods of the church, no government backing. It's really before community monasticism becomes popular in the church, which is really the context where a lot of this manuscript copying happens. Um, and so in those early periods, part of it is that texts got burned a lot, but part of it is also that the um, apparatus that really starts reproducing and copying these texts on a large scale just hasn't cropped up yet. It really can't without Constantine. It can't do it without a Christian emperor, government backing, organized monastic communities, none of which happens really before Constantine.
Okay. Yeah.
And as for the question on the mothers of the church, hard to say. My instinct would be to say that that's not related because a pagan emperor who is censoring Christianity wholesale probably doesn't care enough about Christianity to make a distinction between texts written by the fathers and the mothers.
Okay.
Maybe a Christian emperor knows enough about Christianity to know that distinction and care enough about it to make the distinction, but a pagan emperor, I mean, the pagan emperors, it sort of differed from emperor to emperor how much they knew Christianity. Some of them, like Julian, knew it really well, some not so much, but mostly it doesn't seem like they knew it well enough to make a distinction that subtle.
Okay. Yeah, that was. You can continue on. That was Yeah. Continue on with what you were saying before. That was a question that arose.
Yeah. So Diocletian, yeah, major persecution, pretty severe. But I mentioned it could vary from region to region, and some parts of the empire were much nicer to Christians than others. So one of the nicer parts of the empire was in the west under Constantius, who, I mean, he persecuted Christians some, like he would shutter churches, he would take church property and confiscate it, but he was probably the lightest of the four in terms of his treatment of the Christians. He was kinder to them than certainly Diocletian and some of the others. He was pretty comparative. I mean, comparatively, he was pretty soft on them, which was important because his son eventually becomes one of the four, Constantine. And although we don't have any evidence that Constantine is Christian in the beginning, we do know that he has some Christian family members. He has a half sister named Anastasia. He has Helen or Helena. So he has some Christian family members in the royal household, even though he himself is not one. So he presumably is exposed to Christianity, perhaps from early on, even if he doesn't ever, at least initially, become Christian himself. And so Constantine's there. He's sort of on the scene while these persecutions are happening. His father is persecuting Christians, but he's doing so more softly than some of the others. And eventually Diocletian,
it's okay.
I've had to say it. But so eventually the persecutions under him end. When he's at sort of the tail end of his life, he issues an edict ending the persecutions. And then they sort of come to an end. Christians are in a kind of precarious position at that point because they're not really sure whether these persecutions are going to continue. Are we free of them? Is this a brief respite before the next emperor comes along and pummels us again? So Christians are sort of in an odd spot at this point. Meanwhile, the tetrarchy is, to put it kindly, they're not getting along very well, as can be probably expected. All four think that they should be the one in charge, which quickly leads to some civil wars. And
it's important to note. It's probably important to note too, isn't some of them come from Diocletian's family, right?
Yes, and some of them want to continue the persecutions, which is also important to note.
Which is Is Licinius one of them? I know Maximian is one.
Yes,
I think Licinius is one.
Yes. Yeah, that sounds right.
Anyway, the point that I was trying to make is it's literally like family war.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. It's unfortunately infighting in the royal family is that's as pretty much every country that's ever had a royal family has had to deal with that, and Rome was no exception. And so these civil wars break out sort of in the early 4th century, with Constantine vying for power just like the other tetrarchs. And during an important battle, during one of these civil wars, Milvian Bridge, Constantine has this vision, which differs slightly depending on which source you're reading, what the vision actually was. But according to the most popular version of the preserved accounts of this, Constantine has a dream in which he sees a vision of the chi rho, the monogram representing the name of Christ, and he hears the words "in hoc signo vinces," in this sign you will conquer. And so he has his army put the hero on their shields before this important battle, and then he wins the battle, which some contemporaries, especially pagan ones, were sort of questioning, how they had their own explanations for that vision. People sort of disagreed. Some people thought it was the hero. Some people thought maybe it was a cross. Some people thought it was the sun god. So there's some disagreement, but what we do know and what really matters is that at Milvian Bridge, Constantine has this decisive military victory, and he credits it to the Christian God. And then very soon after Milvian Bridge, we get this document issued by Constantine called the Edict of Milan, which offers religious toleration for all in the empire, including for Christians. Which the edict technically is not the first time that an emperor has issued an edict granting tolerance like that, but it is, in some ways, a pretty watershed one. So this edict calls for permanent tolerance, calls for the return of confiscated church property to Christians, and it is a little ambiguous, but it seems to credit the Christian God particularly. Christians are named in the edict several times, and it's one of the only religious groups that's explicitly mentioned by name in the Edict of Milan. So even though it's not it's not per se a document that makes Christianity the state religion of the empire or something like that. That doesn't come until the reign of Theodosius I in the 380s. But here, at least, we get Christianity is legalized, and it's seemingly given some preferential treatment by Constantine. So now Christians are sort of celebrating, okay, we went from Decius and Diocletian a few decades ago to now we get tolerance and we get our church property back. And we have an emperor who might be Christian. At this point, he's not baptized, but he seems to be showing deferential treatment to the Christians, which is a real reversal from a few decades prior. And Christians celebrate it as this victory of providence. I mean, Eusebius writes his ecclesiastical history as if Constantine's conversion is like the hinge point of Roman history. So this is a huge, huge moment for the church. And the church is excited about this new prestige, excited about the persecution coming to an end. And then, right as the church finds this newfound peace and prestige in the empire, then controversy erupts in Alexandria, and thus begins the Arian controversy.
Yeah, I think two things that I want to go to very quickly before we get into the Nicene controversy, because the celebration of Christians, of the Christian emperor, because this is what they were saying was, there's an eruption of excitement. They can go to church again and not feel scared, and they can worship the Christian God publicly, and they still face sociological shame, but it's not as bad because the Roman Empire submitted to the Roman emperor. That's just how it worked.
Right.
But two things that I thought were really interesting in the Edict of Milan, like you said, so it's really granting freedom to all religions. But there's one line in it when I read it earlier that struck me. And I didn't even think about it in this way until you mentioned it. But the person writing it says, we grant complete freedom to the Christians and all religions. Yeah. So really, they're really giving religious freedom to everyone. But it is genuinely like you can see that Christians are the forefront of this, just based on the language that gets used in that one particular line where it does mention everybody. The only religion named is Christianity. The other thing I wanted to mention, Eusebius being probably the most famous historian of the church, his historiography in his writing called the Ecclesiastical History, one of the most important documents in church history that we have. It gives way for a lot of early church patristic theology. But he writes in that a sort of, biography of Constantine. And he's talking about sort of Constantine's response to having won the war against Maximius, who has like 7 names: Maximius, Maximian Dia, Maxentius. Like, there's like, it's awful how many names this guy has. And then there's like 2 writings on him. But Eusebius writes in this that, and I'm going to just read the quote. He says that Constantine, being convinced that he required greater aid than military force, and this is at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, which is circa 311, 312, probably more 312, because everything was a very quick turnaround once he won that war. It says, because of the wicked and magical enchantments that were so diligently practiced at the tyrant's court. That goes against the Hiero idea already right there and supports the Cairo idea. Constantine sought divine aid, counting the possession of arms and of a numerous soldiery of secondary importance, but declaring the cooperating power of God to be irresistible and unconquerable. Then this line, it struck me. He considered, therefore, what God he should choose as his patron. Constantine saw the contrast between the gods of paganism who failed to protect their worshippers and his father Constantius' monotheism, and decided to cleave to the latter. That True. There was, when reading these documents, when Chris sent them to me, I read that and went, this is amazing. This is Constantine's response, and now starts to begin to be the response of everybody else. Like, that's right. Diocletian thinks it's the Christian's problem. No, it's just that these gods don't respond. But this God responds. He has to be real. So then Constantine converts. But like you said, controversy arises in Alexandria with the Arian controversy.
Yes. And one side note before we move to the Arian controversy, there is a tricky sticking point about that monotheism in the royal household, which is that some of the monotheists are Christians, but some of them are sun worshippers. And one of the most popular cults at this time, aside from the imperial cult and aside from the various regional paganisms that you might have in mind, was a monotheism that worshipped the sun as the sole invictus, the unconquerable sun. And so one of the reasons why people question Constantine's Christianity is because he'll often use that language of unconquered and speak about the sun and this connection between Jesus as the son of righteousness and the sun. And some people have suggested that Constantine's after this syncretistic combination of Sol Invictus worship, Christianity, and other Christians have sort of made use of that imagery at other places, like the fact that Christians worship on Sunday, Son of Righteousness, all of that. So there is sort of an asterisk there because of the Sol Invictus monotheism. There were a lot of committed monotheists in the empire who worshipped the sun and had no interest in Christianity. But it is the case that whatever Constantine's, I mean, it's hard to know about the particular content of his own spiritual life, but we do know, at least, like you said, the Edict of Milan very clearly is preferential to the Christians, and it doesn't hide that at all.
Yeah. And I do think it's important to note, though, Constantine does get baptized later. But that is a part of the controversy, because who he gets baptized by is an Arian bishop. And if you don't know what
Eusebius of Nicomedia.
And so if you don't know what Arianism is, and so this is sort of, we've covered Constantine and the importance of that. I totally think we covered basically everything someone needs to know about the era. I mean, there's so much more, but that's like the basics of what you need to know about.
Yeah, we've got the cliff notes of it, I suppose.
Pretty much. So now, sort of cliff noting the Nicene controversy, because there's so much that we could talk about. But when it comes to this controversy particularly, it is specifically, and the one thing we probably should talk about, and then if we want to go into more of Nicene, that's probably another episode type thing, because Then we have to go into like 6 different things that they talked about at the council, including Santa Claus smacking Arian across the face.
Yes.
But is the distinction between Arianism and then Nicene theology that gets agreed upon, which we called the Nicene Creed. And so this controversy that it becomes the big debate in the middle to, or kind of early, but middle really to late 4th century. What is it? Why is it important? And then a place where I'd like to land, as my pastor would say, land the plane, is I want to bring this to today and talk about very quickly, is that Arian controversy still alive today? And so take it away.
I'll answer the last one. Yes. I think every generation has to relitigate these questions and has to reaffirm the Nicene Creed. And I think that's part of the way we know that is that in every generation, there are well-known public theologians who question Nicaea, who question whether Arius was really all that bad, and who, whether they mean to or not, support a functional Arianism. And so I think it's always up to the next generation to sort of relitigate and reaffirm and rededicate themselves to Nicaea. So the last one I'll answer the easiest. Yes, still a problem today. Always will be until the eschaton, and we always have the joy and opportunity to redefend Nicaea. So the controversy leading up to Nicaea was about several things, and I'm going to try and explain as quickly as I can. So one of the questions was, how does Jesus relate to the Father? Most Christians at that point accepted that Jesus was somehow divine, but there were disagreements about how divine was Jesus, how did Jesus relate to the Father. Another question was about whether Jesus existed eternally or not. That was another important question. And then another sort of related question was, is it proper to worship Jesus, or is worship preserved for the Father alone? So those were sort of the 3 main questions stewing around at this time. The Nicene answer was Jesus is consubstantial with the Father, which means that whatever it means for the Father to be God, Jesus is all of that. Nicenes also argued that Jesus was eternal. As long as the Father existed, Jesus always also existed. In a popular Nicene line that Nicenes would sort of chant at their Arian enemies was, there was not when the Son was not, which is to say there was no time when the Son did not exist. And then as for the third point, Nicenes said, because Jesus is fully God, because Jesus is whatever the Father is, it is proper to offer worship and prayer to Jesus, just as it is proper to do so to the Father. Arians, depends on what kind of Arians you're talking about, might answer yes to one of those or no to one of those, but for all of them, they could never affirm a full yes to all of them. They had issues with all 3 to varying degrees, depending on which Arians you're talking about.
Yeah. So, contrary to weird belief, Nicea is not about the biblical canon at all. That's very much another conversation.
Yes.
But, really, what one needs to know is that this takes place partially because it's an ecumenical council. That's why we call it the First Ecumenical Council. Well, first, second, there's arguments between whether the Council of Jerusalem was first. But this is really one of the important first ones, because this establishes who Christ is for Christianity progressing forward, and allows for the conversation of the Trinity to occur later at other creeds that will happen in the next couple hundred years. But here is the controversy that arises, and the reason that Constantine's so involved is because Constantine falls in line with Arian belief sometimes. And then sometimes he falls on the other side. He organizes Nicaea, helps to organize it, and gives a space for it. And so bishops from everywhere come, hundreds of bishops. I forget the exact number. And so
maybe around 300. We're not sure.
Which is unbelievable. I mean, they're traveling so many miles.
Yeah.
And not by plane or car. So this controversy, now that we talk about it, I think it would be worthwhile to probably spend almost another 45 minutes talking about it in another episode, probably.
Yeah, I think so.
Because
even just talking about even giving the briefest overview I was already thinking of so many background things I wanted to explain and sidebars that need it. Yeah, it almost feels like we may need another episode to talk about the theological background to it before we even get to the council itself.
I really actually, I really agree with you, because there's so much that I kept wanting to say, because there's so many words that start to become important,
relevant,
and they start to spark controversy, and this starts to spark the real controversy between the East and the West, and then the East and the West becomes a big thing, and then Constantine from here on out and his theology becomes a thing, because if he's Arian, well, what does that mean for the empire, and what happens as we progress? And so I think let's stop here. I think this is a comfortable place to stop. And then in the next episode, let's pick up at Nicaea, and let's and this is almost giving kind of a framework for those listening. What we'll do in the next episode is we'll explain the theological background of everything that's starting to pop up, and we'll just walk through it all. And if we can get from Nicaea to the next council, sick. If not, that makes sense too, because in this next episode, now you have the background, sort of what you should know going into it. We will cover what happens, because I think, like, we even touched on it, and you said it's a controversy that is occurring constantly that we have to defend in every generation.
Yeah.
And I think the thing that I've taken away most from this entire episode is the idea that theology is not just a thing people do that are highly intellectual in the academy. It's very much a thing that has built what we have today as the church. And I think when we go to explain the Nicene doctrines and theology, you and I know it, but I think those listening, you'll begin to realize, oh my gosh, so this is where things begun. This is how we this is how we got what we got today.
Mm-hmm.
And so, Chris, do you have any last words to it, or?
Just tell our listeners, stay tuned. We've got a lot of background to cover. We'll talk about all sorts of people with cool names, Irenaeus and Origen and Tertullian and Plotinus, and we'll talk about John and Paul. And stay tuned. We've got a lot to cover. And like I said, like you said, these things are not just things for the past. Every generation has to sort of receive this stuff and decide whether to defend it and keep it or leave it behind. So thanks for being with us, and hope you stick with us for the future. Yeah. May our God and Creator, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, him who is indwelling all of us who call ourselves Christians and have received Christ as our Lord, continue to be with you and to be with us. We'll jump into the Nicene controversy next. And if you're listening to this when that's out, you could just go listen to it. If not, give us like a week, and we'll do it. So, love you guys. Take care, and we will be back soon.